Hello, I'm David Eichholtz with David Richard Gallery, located in New York City. We're actually in East Harlem. And today I'm with Andrew Huffman, the artist's work we're standing in front of. And this is Andrew's second solo exhibition with our gallery. And we're debuting a new body of work. And that's what we're going to talk about today. The title of the show is
Hued Vibrations.
Hued Vibrations. And we'll get into that later. But the main thing I wanted to focus on initially are two things that are a big departure from the first solo show and the previous body of work. And the first being, we're debuting Diptychs. These are conceived and executed as two distinct panels, but conceived to be exhibited together. And they're also two different sizes. This is 30 by 30, a pair of 30 by 30 inch. And then we have further down 30 by 60s as a pair to making a 60 by 60 painting.
Right.
And 60 by 60 is sort of a normal format for you, as is 30 by 30.
Right. Yep.
So the thing is that this has now introduced sort of a horizontal format by putting them together.
Right.
But the other thing that's really interesting about these is the earlier work was a more rigorous systemic sort of grid pattern.
Right.
And here, he's really exploring a term that's used in sort of pattern painting, referred to as tessellation. And the nice thing about that is it gives him the ability to do compositions that have an asymmetry about them.
Right.
So they can take on a bit of a narrative feeling as opposed to just rigorously a geometric grid.
Right.
With the only variation being color. Now you're varying form as well as, palette. So that's what I'd really like to talk about today is why the diptych. I mean, I love them. I think they're fantastic.
Yeah, sure.
So I'd like to kind of start with, we're standing in front of one of the diptychs right now, and this one is Frisbee with Luna, and Luna's his dog. And we'll also get into why the titles have sort of changed too. That's the other departure, is the titles have moved from being just a term modulated, which described the earlier series, and then a number. And the number was the number of values and colors in the composition. So these are a more narrative title,
right?
And that's by design. So we really have three things we need to kind of cover.
Sure.
So let's start with why a diptych? And let's go ahead and we can cover a lot of ground in this particular painting.
Sure. Yeah, and the diptychs I find is a opportunity to have the two panels have a conversation about each other while also having a serious tension in the middle. Because all sides of the painting are painted, so it kind of adds this other element into the paintings and the tension obviously that comes into the middle. Mm-hmm. While also, if you notice the tessellation pattern, a typical tessellation does not mirror when you would fold it in half, but these, however, do mirror the pattern itself, not the color, however. But if you look at them, this tessellation on the left is the exact same tessellation on the right, only mirrored. So the tessellation, it's kind of like breaking the rules of a tessellation in some ways. So taking a tessellation and mirroring it.
So here, if we basically had a fold here, what you can see is these two are pointing in. So it's not 100%. Which way do you fold it to get that?
Well, just like if you folded it from this center line, this would mirror itself.
Okay, so within this panel, it's not a true tessellation, but the diptych is.
Yeah, well, just in one panel, it is a true tessellation, but then when it actually mirrors itself, then it's kind of breaking the rules of a tessellation, because a tessellation usually, it wouldn't mirror itself if you folded it. And
there is a painting that is more obviously demonstrates that over here that we'll get to later.
Right.
The other thing too is when you said that you paint it on the sides, what I want to make sure is that people see what we're talking about here. So this pentagonal shape, which he'll talk a little bit more about, is sort of abstracted. It's not really, when we think of a pentagon, it's not exactly a true pentagon.
Right.
But and then these actually flow off the canvas.
Right.
So that's why we have squares, because it continues off the canvas.
Right.
In theory.
Right.
And so that's it's repeating these sort of, as you can see here, what you're doing is clipping it when we come to the edge.
Right.
But the sides, when you paint those, it does word wrap, and it definitely feels like it's continuing, but it's not exactly the pattern. So you make a judgment call there on how you actually paint the sides.
Right.
Is there a rigorous rule, or is it sort of how you feel about the painting at that time?
Right. Yeah, I mean, for me, it changes with all the... So, I mean, another thing I can talk about, just in regard to answer another one of the pertinent things that are coming up in the work, is changing the titles. Our old titles that I had for the last body with the solo show I did with you guys was modulated. So all of the pieces were called modulated 36, for instance, where there'd be 36 colors involved in the painting. Those titles I really enjoyed for that body of work, and they're kind of enigmatic in that sense. They don't give away too much to the viewer, but I felt like some of those were a little test tube-like. And so with these titles, I wanted to be a little more playful and reference music and also other themes and different parts of my life and inspirations for the paintings. So these titles are different. So this one being Frisbee with Luna is literally directly referencing and taking inspiration from some normal things and I would do in my life with my dog, like a day-to-day routine.
Right.
And so the colors are coming from her collar and like the green Frisbee we would play with, and she was a cattle dog with like blues and grays, and that's kind of where these like blued gray palette comes from.
Yeah. What's also with the colors, the brighter colors, it is more whimsical and playful, and and also it sort of makes you think about these shapes, because if as a Frisbee you think of these things as sort of spiraling.
Right.
These things sort of spiraling, would be sort of interesting. But the other thing too that I like about this piece, and you started doing it with the modulated series in that last show, where it's this huge use of neutrals. So all these grays and charcoals, which has an interesting effect, and also in this with these pops of white.
Right.
Which is not something you usually do.
It's true.
There is in this other painting over here that we'll get to, which also is a very unusual painting. What's your thought on the grays? What brings you to the grays?
Yeah, so for me, I feel like with these colors being so, some of them being so pungent with the actual chroma involved in the color intensity, I feel that they need those grays in some way to balance them out, but also I use the grays as an opportunity for color subtlety. So if you look deep into the grays, you will see some of the grays are more reddish grays or greenish grays, or some of them are orangey grays, or even this white that you were just talking about is kind of an orangey gray, high key gray. So I am still sneaking little tidbits of color in there. And the idea with some of those whites too, that orangey white, is to work off of the blue and the grays next to it. So like this procession of grays is based on a very bluey kind of Payne's gray, which is a blue cast, also with like raw umber in it. But so I'm kind of playing with different color relationships and complementary colors too, but in the grays, so more in a subtle sense.
Well, it's kind of interesting you say that, because that's one thing that Julian Stansack, known for op art, Julian never used a pure color.
Right.
He, never used pure black or pure white. Let me be really clear about what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So Julian loved that, because one time I asked him, there was one particular painting that was white and like a navy blue and black. At least when you looked at it, that's how it felt to you when you walked up to it.
Yeah.
But yet you would see yellow.
Right.
And you're like, what's going on? Where's this yellow coming from? And he giggled, and he says, well, it's because it's not really pure black.
Exactly.
It's actually a plummy black.
Right.
And it's not really a typical navy blue.
Right.
And but he said, moreover, the white isn't pure white.
Right.
So and he comes at it. He was a student of Albers, so he's clearly a color theorist, and as well as really like to explore and exploit in his paintings these color interactions.
Right.
And even though they were all vivid and bold colors frequently, even in those ones that were black, white, gray that you felt like were neutrals, they always still had color popping out of him. And he knew how to play off of these neutrals and that subtle dosage of a color having a profound effect to either damper or key up something.
Right.
And so I think even people like you who didn't study with Albers and you really weren't a color theorist per se, but you have an intuitive sense about color and you like bold colors, but you like looking at them in terms of as a whole composition, it feels like.
Right.
And it does feel like you try and damper them down sometimes with the neutrals, because I'm looking around in here, and this show does have a lot of neutrals that we think of as grays, but also I do notice in the next one we're going to go to, you really have grayed down some of the blues and greens.
Right, yep.
And I'll be curious how you actually did that, if you used complements or if you used black or white when we get to them.
Sure.
But my sneaking suspicion is you used another color, not black or white.
Well, and also just to strike a chord with what you're bringing up right there is even these purples in here do have little tidbits of yellow into the purple. So it is neutralizing the purple itself and just making it more of a naturalistic color.
Right.
So it is very conscious in this whole body of work that I'm doing that. Where
and the net effect of that to me when I'm looking at these is that, because I've been looking at that, noticing that this purple, this sort of plummy color and this blue, our bluey purple, they are grayed down.
Yep.
And what the net effect is, even though this isn't a totally keyed up hot pink, it makes that hotter.
Feel like it, feels like
it makes it, because what it does is that pink now steals from these.
And also this being a gray, but next to this, it looks like a white.
It looks white.
Even though it is an orange.
So again, it's the color interaction is working not in the way the op art artist did it, where it's vibrational, even though you call these hued vibrations. This isn't as vibrational as some of your other paintings where they were more rigorously in a grid. And more pure color, less neutral. And but I think it works extremely well in this painting. And I do like, and I often, when I write about work like yours and Mocha Léger and Leo Vallador and people like that, it's this internal tension or torsion, artists are able to create. And both of those artists, I like to use, torque or tension because they're shaped canvases. Because shaped canvases combined with vector geometry and really being careful on your color selection and color interaction, you can really key up the interior of a painting. And what that does is, in their case, is to make you feel, it excites your eye and it gets your eye more receptive to the concept that could be a three-dimensional shape. That this thing could be coming in or out of the picture plane, augmented by or suggested by the outer perimeter being shaped and not rigorously a square or a rectangle. You kind of do the same thing here with your desire to have this intense figure ground. So these grays almost become your ground, and these things become the figure. And what it does is what we were just talking about is your way of using color to kind of key that up. And I think it really gets excited when you come on this, when you look at this on the inside, because all of a sudden now you get this not characteristic shock of the green and this sort of orange in the interior. That's not consistent with the shapes in in this center of each painting. So there's a couple subtle tricks here that you've leveraged very cleverly. And but that's also why on these paintings, what I pointed out in some of the writing I've done is, you do identify very much as a pattern painter in many ways. And you've already talked about how these things are asymmetric and aside, but together they're symmetrical. And that's why I sort of said, so all is well in the world of pattern painting. At the end of the day, in the aggregate. And so, anyway, that's. I knew there was a lot to cover on this painting. So we've covered basically your palette, your use of the neutrals and how you really leverage those.
The title itself.
The title.
If you look at the way that the painting moves, when you think about a frisbee, it generally goes up and then comes back down. So it's kind of like this movement. The actual pattern goes up and then it comes back down. So it's also thinking about the movement of the path of flight a Frisbee would take.
And using the colors, the hot colors for that.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's clever. That's really good.
Right.
Yeah, so in that way, we'll touch on it in one of these other ones where you really want to get to more content in the painting, which is another thing. So it's actually item 4 to cover. But so we've covered a lot of ground on this one. So what we'll do is move to the one, another diptych that's a little bit different compositionally. We're going to continue talking about using this other smaller diptych that now reads as a horizontal because of the composition of this and the palette, it really accentuates a couple of other points, how basically the same format and the same concept of using this tessellation approach creates a whole different sort of feel.
Right.
So in this one, it now looks much more rigorously symmetrical.
Right.
And as you and I have talked about, it even when you first look at it, it looks like it's completely symmetrical, even with colors, but it's not.
Right.
And the neutrals are mirrored, and the purples are mirrored, but the other colors are not. So it's very subtle.
Right. Yep.
And but the other thing too is, this is derived out of a derivation of the pentagonal that you were describing.
Yep.
We should have probably talked about it at the other show, at the other piece. But
yeah, right.
Anyway, but go ahead and sort of repeat that because this is really a modified hexagonal.
Right. Yep.
But it came to you
from a pentagonal tessellation.
And looking at it as opposed to the
crosses.
The arrow-shaped pentagonal shapes that he had in that other painting came together like this, and it created a cross.
Right.
But the way you look at the aggregation of those, and if you don't look at it as a cross, you kind of force your eye to not look at it that way, then what you see is, using those arrow shapes, it actually creates a hexagonal shape.
Right.
And there's a pattern of hexagonal shapes in that other painting that march along and again create a whole nother pattern. And that's the other thing too about pattern painting for people to think about is, and that's where the interplay, your tools are not only just the pattern, but the palette, but also how you leverage then things like we were talking about how Andrew has with now using neutrals and with high key colors. Because what it does is it throws your eye to look at those shapes and see other shapes.
Right.
So it's sort of like color interaction, how two different colors creates a third color.
Right.
It's the same idea. When you're looking at a rigorous pattern like that, depending upon how you construct your palette, the arrangement on there, your eye actually sees different shapes. And that's what he's saying came out here. So what we're talking about is these two, just look at this purple and this sort of tealy blue. Sure. When you look at these now, it creates essentially a hexagonal sort of to the side.
Right.
And because of the way the color palette and some colors, the push-pull of color, some colors coming forward and some going back, this also looks like a cube.
Right, right.
So again, it's all this trickery. So not only are you seeing different patterns because of the color, but now we're actually thinking now you're doing something more three-dimensional and that these are actually optical.
Right, right. Well, and for me, just when I was working with the pentagonal tessellation, over time, I started to think that those shapes that we just discussed, the hexagonals, started to be really interesting. And I thought it was really interesting how they were happening, even though it was a pattern of pentagonal shapes. So then I wanted to try to probe those and magnify that and see how that changed, even though that was kind of like the underlying skeleton of those tessellations. Mm-hmm. So with this painting, I'm trying to get into that and investigate it and kind of put those under the microscope, those structures, and see where it takes us. And then another interesting thing just about this piece in general, the title is Glimpse of the Octopus Tides. And subconsciously maybe too, I was thinking about octopuses and looking at different types of camouflage in nature as I was with some of the other paintings, and kind of how some of the colors and subduedness with an octopus, you could be right next to it and it would blend into the background. So some of the subtleties in color and change and it not being exactly symmetrical, I was trying to elicit some of those things that octopuses do in their natural environment. And then another interesting thing is I spend about 5 to 6 days a week, I go sit in mountain streams in water, in cold water, and like practice cold water therapy and just sit there for an hour to 2 hours. So it's kind of, I was wondering why was I thinking about water, and it's, you know, I spend about 5 days a week sitting in cold water and being around streams and listening to water. And so I think that very naturally, just like I would go play Frisbee with my dog, started to creep into the work. And then the octopus idea too is just, I think, a fascinating, intelligent animal and very elusive. And it basically lives off of outsmarting other animals, including sharks and any of its predators. And so I just thought that was an interesting animal to kind of pay an homage to and investigate.
Because these do feel like the head is here and these are like tentacles coming out.
Right.
But also the palate definitely lends you to think of something more aquatic.
Oceanic, yeah, absolutely.
Under the sea, looking through the water downward. So yeah, it definitely. So again, the titles are becoming more narrative and suggesting, you know, the outcome, but also, again, you had commented even a couple of years ago when I first met you in that first show that you're trying to get what you refer to as more content into the work.
Right.
And I think you started by, as you gave us as an example, trying to take something that was personal or that you liked, like this necklace that you had given your sister, which, you know, had an emotional connection with you, and then deconstructing that. Now, what you're trying to do is take these works and trying to have the title be suggestive of the work to kind of lead people down that path. And so now what you're trying to do is use palette and the geometry to sort of create more of an image in people's mind, and having the title be suggestive to kind of lead them that way. But there's another nuance about the titles that you might want to elaborate on.
Yeah, it is pretty important. So all of the titles, there's 7 works in the show, 10 panels, because 3 of them are diptychs. But each of them reference the letters used to make music. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G.
The first letter of the title.
First letter of so this one being glimpse, so this would be G, so glimpse of the octopus tides. And then another thing about this too is, and we can talk about that a little bit more when we go to some of the other paintings, what the title is and how that references that letter as well. But another interesting thing about this diptych here is it does reference the painting next to us, which I painted first, which is called Descending Datura, so D. And we'll get to that later, but as you can see, this one is kind of heightening the floral type shape of a flower, where I'm taking the exact same pattern and seeing how color can influence it in a different way and how you perceive it in a different way.
But it's also a good one to go to next because it's derived out of this overarching shape of a pentagonal that ends up being a hex, depending upon how you color it and construct it. I'm trying to think of the other point I wanted to make on this one. This one, first, when you painted the sides, this one actually appears to extend the pattern. So in this case,
it does.
It's more rigorous, and it's like a word wrap of the pattern around the side.
It's true, yeah.
And
where some of them, like that one, was different.
It was not. It was, and so again, it's just you kind of, breaking with, pattern painting is like early code. Artists would have like an algorithm. One of the best ones to think of is like Gloria Klein, and where hers were an algorithm, and she would lay out. The algorithm would describe mathematically how to create her grids, and she would use hash marks, and then she would assign colors a number, and then go through with her numbers, and it's very rigorous. If it's a 1, then it's this color. If it's a 2, it's that color. If it's a 3. And then the pattern would emerge out of that. But Gloria, a lot of times, would purposely create a hiccup. And just to add some interest or to do something on purpose.
Sure,
so again, you know, some artists were very rigorous, like Clark Rickard. I
Right.
don't think ever breaks with pattern
Right, right.
Or the algorithm.
Right.
Gloria loved doing that because it would throw you off, and sometimes she would also overlap. She
Right.
had multiple ones going on, so they became very challenging to paint.
And I guess
Because you got to
the
keep
way
while you're counting up.
Clark does that by his drips, leaving his drips. Is like
Yeah.
probably in his own mind, that's how, yeah.
Yeah, and Richard Callaway was the same way. Richard wasn't a fuss budget about staying in the lines.
Right.
But yet, when you looked at his stuff, they were so
Right.
so rigorously geometric.
Right.
You know, and so precise. And you get up there and look at it, and you're like going, "Well, I could have done that."
Yeah, right, right, yeah.
You know, and,
Yeah.
and you realize he was mark making.
Yeah.
But it was so precisely done in terms of this precision with the pattern
Right.
that these patterns would emerge in your eye. We immediately, when we see something gridded, we immediately think it's rigid, it's hard edge, it's geometric.
Right.
You know,
Yeah,
of
yeah,
course.
right.
So
You-
it's kind of
yeah.
funny how
Yeah.
your eye, takes in this information, but our brain is so intuitive about
Rationalizing it.
rationalizing it. Oh, that's a grid. It's hard edge.
Yeah.
It's geometric. And only
Yeah.
when you get up to it.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what was funny about yours. The first time I ever saw yours, I said, well, I would like to see these things in person. So, because they look really, really precise and pristine.
Yeah.
And I saw yours. I'm like, going, oh man, they really are precise and pristine.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
but I think in the 80s, when this came around, that was also people, were experimenting with less rigor in the hard edge and the geometric, because in the 60s and 70s, there was so much of that. And, but again, it's kind of, it's fun how you can kind of play with these things.
Right.
The other thing too, and hopefully we will get back to it, but the other thing you sort of, kind of made a nod to going forward is now you want to try and figure out, not only is music very important to you and you like to play a lot of music and you like to create these sort of lyrical sort of passages in your paintings, which clearly comes out of like refrains and music.
Sure.
But you've also have sort of foreshadowed that you're going to be more deliberate in how you bring music in.
Right.
So this was sort of, I wouldn't say an experiment. I mean, you made a conscious decision. You're going to do titles to be narrative.
Right.
The interiors of the paintings are going to reference that narrative
Right.
or suggest that narrative.
Right.
And you've also decided right now with the titles, you're definitely going to incorporate music.
Right.
But now what you're going to do is surprises, I guess, the next body of work
Right.
is going to be now how you actually make it feel more musical.
Right, right.
And reference that interiorly within the painting.
And even the title of the show, Hued Vibrations,
Yeah.
is kind of a play on the Beach Boys' Good Vibrations, where hued vibrations, it's ambiguous. Is it good or is it bad? Because obviously, as we know, this is a very weird time. And so some of these palettes, it's not that they're bad or not optimistic, but they're not necessarily just good and poppy. Some of them are very more subdued and serious and feel a little more, serious or different tones. So
now you got me singing Hued Vibrations to the Beach Boys song. Thank you very much. On that note, no pun intended, we'll move on to the other painting. The previous painting, Descending Datura, you referenced this painting.
Right.
And Descending Datura, in terms of musical parlance, it was a decrescendo. It was of it was descending.
Right.
Here, this one has those same hexagonal shapes, but they're solids
going
as
up
opposed to
too.
divided.
Right.
So that rigorous sort of vertical bar that you had in that other painting is not here.
Right.
And also because of the way you've used the colors in your pattern, you don't have that rigorous horizontal either. Right. So, but you do see this, as you said, the overall direction of these hexagonals, whether they're divided or not, is ascending.
Right.
So they're going up. So together, and you had mentioned this was to the left of Descending Datura, which was to the right when you were painting them on the same wall.
Correct.
So you could see that they together are full crescendo.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yep.
So that's again how now you actually already are bringing musical.
Right.
More about how you think about the notes and when you look at patterns and rhythms within music, these are already sort of mimicking that on a sort of a grander scale. But this one also is probably the most asymmetric of all the paintings.
Right.
And And so how did you achieve that? Because there is a rigorous, as I'm standing here, actually from an angle you can kind of see this a lot better.
Sure.
That this hex is here. It looks like what you've done is broken up the rhythm and introduced some horizontals.
Right.
As opposed to verticals, which has an interesting effect because they now feel like cubes looking into a cube.
Right.
Oddly.
Right.
So,
yeah, and so the title of this one, you know, is keeping in the theme E. This one is Euclidean Razzle Dazzle Evades Virus Torpedo. So a little breathy for a title. There's a lot packed in there, but what the title really references to is in World War I and World War II, but World War I is when it started happening. In regard to a lot of the other paintings and thinking about camouflage, there was someone who, they started painting warships, you know, with these very geometric, as you know, the razzle-dazzle painting. And the idea was that when U-boats would come up and would see or spot the ships, hopefully they were far enough away, but they were painted with all these striations, and it was really hard to tell what direction the ship was going, or if it was going sideways or going away from or close to. But ironically, they proved that this, you know, wasn't very effective. And so the U-boats were still firing at these ships and destroying them, essentially. Right. But so the kind of idea behind it too is I started conceptualizing this painting while this pandemic just started, and you were kind of sifting through all the information and how serious this situation was, but also trying to remain optimistic about it, even though it's kind of ironic that I referenced a, you know, razzle-dazzle ship in an oceanic, you know, being surrounded by like ocean and a wave. So that's kind of where the coloration of this came from. And also, like David mentioned, these verticals and horizontals of this ship is kind of meant to kind of confuse you too about what you're looking at and where it stands in space to one another. But it directly references a ship, kind of floating, you know.
And again, the palette.
The palette,
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, it has a very cool sort of feel to it. But, and also you've really leveraged the complementary aspect of blue and orange, which does definitely keys this up a bit.
Right.
And makes it feel a little bit more vibrational. And so definitely opens up the suggestion, you know, for your mind to see different sort of shapes like cubes and what have you. So
right.
You do see some dimensionality here, but it is clearly the most asymmetric of all of these.
Right. Yep.
From every level, whether it be the geometry or the palette.
For sure.
It is the most narrative feeling.
For sure.
Of all the paintings in this show. And not good or bad. It's just showing how the power of, you know, just a few, breaking up just a few in a pattern of these elements, it completely changes the dynamic.
Completely. And then like Euclid, obviously, the, you know, kind of godfather of geometry,
right.
You know. And so it's kind of like making these references too, where you can kind of float through them, but also if you looked at this painting and you wouldn't look at a battleship. It's not like a, you know, illustration of a battleship, and it's not meant to be at all, but it's just kind of eliciting these types of movements and thinking about our torpedo or like something buzzing around. It's very like circular the way the movements work. So for me, it's a really fun painting. It's kind of like acid jazzy almost. But also a limited palette, so it's seeing what I can do with a pretty limited range of colors, really.
Yeah, no, it is, and it just does have a more limited palette compared to, like, you know, I think the most broad palette seems to be the Frisbee painting.
Yep.
But again, they're all deceptive because some of them are so subtle.
Right.
You know, the value shifts in those grays are so subtle that there's so many different colors in that other diptych over there.
Right.
Just because of, you know, how you've played with
sort
of the ranges.
Yeah,
and it's very subtle. That whole painting is a
yeah,
lot more subtle.
That is the most
than
colors.
say like Frisbee.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So, but Frisbee is so power packed with those few
colors,
bold colors,
yeah.
And it's a smaller painting.
Right.
So, yeah, no, this is a really good example of how the range of the power with the pattern painting by just sort of creating a hiccup or a breakup in that rigor and process.
And yeah, another thing too, just in regard to the palette, is we're talking about the frisbee, the grays from Frisbee with Luna and Glimpse of the Octopus Tides. The grays are the exact same grays in this painting. So it's, I literally mixed up.
Oh, so is this also the orange-white?
Yep, yeah, that same orange-white is in that
Interesting,
painting.
but yeah, see how, look how bright
and
white
you can see how, it reacts
Yeah.
completely differently because of the blues. And again, these blues have orange mixed into them. So it is a neutralized blues, but surrounded by this orange, it seems very, very blue. And it is very blue, but it is a naturalistic blue because I'm mixing the complement in there, which neutralizes it a little bit. So
nice. Another very, very technical piece. So the painting we referenced in the last discussion is this painting right here. And a lot of interesting things here, and actually when we were just talking about it, I now get this one really does have the musical, strong
Descending
reference.
Datura.
Yeah, this is it, Descending Datura. And so
D.
Yeah, D, the note D. But descending, this is a decrescendo. So it's, if you look at this, these are descending in a much more rigorously sort of way. This is the other painting I'd referred to earlier also as being just formally a much more rigorously geometric painting. The palette and just the repeat of the palette. So this is almost like a repeating refrain. It's a decrescendo. It has a lot of musical sort of references inside of it. But the other thing too is this again illustrates probably more clearly when we looked at that first diptych and you sort of just force your eye to not look at how the arrows come together, the points of the four pentagonals, and just sort of look at it sort of in a different way. These are the shapes that emerged out of that. So this ochre and purple. And you see now, if you were to shade all of that in, on that other painting, it would be a hexagonal. And so that's where these come from. They're still inspired by
taking two hexagonals and putting them
together.
together.
And when we get to this other painting, you'll have another opportunity to show that because it's in this other one as well, and probably easier to see because the color palette is more rigorous in this one. But also talk about the other aspect of this, though, in terms of this, the secondary shapes and feet and things that you see in this painting.
Yeah, so like for this painting, a lot of the inspiration for it started, generally speaking, with the tonality and stuff, was looking at datura flowers, other known as like devil's trumpets or moonflowers. And the reason they're called that is the flower opens up at night and it's pollinated by night flying insects. And also my mother grew these flowers all the time. And then the other thing too, with this kind of theme of the show being this kind of like psychotropic kids, album or whatever, is these are psychotropic flowers. I mean, if you ate them, like the Mayans and the Incas would use them for ceremonial reasons. But for me, it's nostalgic. When I was a kid, when I'd like sneak out of the house or whatever, and I was coming back to my house, I would see these glowing flowers, because they were white and they would glow with the moon. But so that's just kind of where it started. I was like, that could be an interesting painting. Just in my mind, really abstractly, I was thinking, how could I reference, nighttime, the moonlight, and also the other painting over there, cadmium caterpillars I painted before this. And the caterpillars I was looking at with that painting were hawk moths, I'm sorry. But so when hawk moths turn into when they turn from a caterpillar, the metamorphosis stage, and go into the flying moth stage, they do pollinate this flower in particular, among many other things. But so they're one of the night flying insects that do pollinate moonflowers. And so I was kind of like referencing them and tying them together, but also thinking about how these flowers and some of the tonalities would kind of bleed into one another in regard to the hue and what time of day it was. And also this kind of mustardy, pollen color directly referenced pollination and pollen.
So just like with Frisbee with Luna, these colors come out of of this.
And this is more like of an homage to like my mother, in my mind, was thinking about my mom having a green thumb, growing up on a farm, always planting flowers. But then also thinking about music and the descending part of it, referencing music like you talked about. So obviously there's a lot of things firing all at once, and I thought that could, be a good springboard for a painting.
So the flower shape this is basically the stamen and the middle part of the flower, and then these are the petals radiating out.
Yeah, the white,
So that's...
And this is like the outside of the petal, yeah, exactly.
Correct.
Yep.
So that's where this flower shape comes from.
Right.
When you talk about the flower shape.
Exactly.
So this is a series of flower shapes.
Exactly.
The other thing too that this painting does, and this is the one earlier that I referred to as more rigorously geometric, because like a lot of pattern painting, like Gloria Klein's, where we talked about she would have patterns layered on top of each other, and if you looked at them, and that's how she would leverage her palette, was to help you see the different patterns. So if you stood different places, or if your eye focused on one of the palettes, you saw a different pattern emerge. Same thing here. So the flower pattern is this pattern that it feels a little bit more skewed, and when you look at the different elements, you get this diagonal going. But at the same time, this is a rigorous, horizontal, and then this bar in here creates like a rigorous vertical. And so you do have this overlapping
grid kind of
lattice
references a grid. Again.
But the way you've applied the color and then using this hex shape as opposed to a square is what allows you then to actually have then a skewed or diagonal grid as well. So this one's actually a good example because your palette is so consistent and everything reads left to right and it's consistent. You're able to see these different things emerge, whereas like a Frisbee with Luna, you don't see any sort of an overarching grid because it's more asymmetric. Within each of the panels. And so that's kind of the nice thing about this work is, that's why when I said, when you look at your work from the first show to this show, you can tell it's your work. The boldness, the rigorous detail, how meticulous it's executed and things like that. But I think there is a level of complexity that's very interesting in this work that's way different. And I think it kind of opens you up to lots of other avenues, whereas when you do just a rigorous sort of grid, you become limited after a while.
For some people, Albers would say he wasn't limited because but for me, I totally agree, and that's why I am. Another interesting thing, just while we're here, before we move to the other painting, is I painted this painting in E, the Euclidean razzle dazzle, right next to each other. And if you look at the diptych formats, in theory, if they were a diptych, the pattern does the same thing as that, basically, where it's taking, like the other Euclidean razzle-dazzle mirrors it, except it's going down this way. So you'll see when we go over there, it's pretty much the same pattern of these.
So together they're a full crescendo.
You'll see when we go over there that this movement is going like this from left to right, and over there that the movement is going from right to left down. So you'll see it.
Nice. And that one is actually really interesting too because it is so asymmetric. And that's where color becomes a real tool for you to pull that off. In a rigorous sort of system. Okay, gotcha. Cool. We're standing in front of cadmium caterpillar, which we've actually referenced a number of times for some different formal aspects. So we're finally standing in front of it. And we haven't gone in front of every painting, but we've touched upon all of them. But this one is probably the most rigorous formally of being all the same pentagonal shape. And this is the caterpillar that you mentioned that pollinates,
Hawk
not
moths.
The caterpillar, but the moth that it becomes is the one that pollinates the datura flower. So these are related even though the palettes couldn't be any more different. But this painting, as you said, is a true tessellation, and explain again just for the viewers, because that's an odd term for a lot of people. And so just this is a good example to point out.
So if you look at this pattern, if you try not to think about the color, but if you just look at the pattern, the tessellated pattern, if you were to fold this pattern, in theory, the pattern it's not symmetrical, it's asymmetrical, so it's a true tessellation. But then another important thing is we were talking about these hexagonal shapes. And so when you look at this painting, you could miss those the hexagonal shapes, it could be like an afterthought where the more you look at the painting, you start to investigate those. Because when you initially look at the painting, or when I do initially, you kind of look at these shapes more. And you look at the relationships of these crosses, this tessellation, this pentagonal tessellation. But then when you look closer, you start to investigate these hexagonal shapes that come out of the painting.
And what's interesting is like here's one here,
right,
and then there's one here,
right,
and then there's one here. So as you see,
right,
is these have a descending sort of movement.
True. Yeah.
And they're stacked one upon each other.
Right.
And because like here's one here, and we showed you then how it moves there, but then here's one here. So these are all these hexagonal shapes are nested within these pentagonal shapes, these arrangements of these pentagonal shapes. And that's what's interesting about pattern painting. And that's how, different artists, like we said, like people like Gloria Klein, well, she wouldn't have done such a big shape. She does smaller ones, but it's still the same idea.
Right.
It's how you can put this geometry together and see different geometries emerge out of them, and you can leverage those by color. Typically, is how most people have done it.
Right.
And you can and you see different things emerging. And this one's pretty rigorous because it feels more like a grid, even though we've said it's a tessellation in true sense of the word.
It's based on a grid. So.
But it's based on a grid.
Yeah.
And so, but the palette we've already talked about. This one wraps perfectly with the pattern.
It does, yeah.
So this one here, it made more sense for you to keep it where it just continued the pattern because it worked.
Yeah.
Whereas with the Frisbee with Luna didn't really.
Yeah, right.
And it wouldn't have had the same impact.
Right.
Because you were trying to do something different in that painting.
Yeah.
The other thing too here is these colors, like this is reading white probably to people who are looking at this video right now. And to some extent even here in person it does.
Sure, yeah.
But as we get closer now after having talked about it, this is really like a seafoam.
Seafoam green,
it's not
kind of,
really, it's white that you've...
It's a grade greenish.
Yeah, it's a gray green.
High key though, but yeah.
But next to these really strong, darker colors, it really gives that pop.
Right.
And gives a little bit of a rest to your eye,
right,
much like the black does, but it creates these internal contrasts. So this one is very vibrational in many ways because, and these are the colors of that caterpillar.
Right.
So you're just mimicking what's really in nature.
Right.
But it just shows you again how much pattern is so ever present in nature and how these colors can be so dynamic. And again, it is camouflage though too, correct?
Yeah.
For that caterpillar.
It is, yeah, because they spend most of their time
on vegetation.
Yeah, just eating, yeah, exactly. And then another thing is this green is the same green basically that's in Frisbee with Luna.
So yeah, there's a lot of internal harmonies here, like you had mentioned previously, like the gray tones in the
Euclidean
Razzle Dazzle.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of internal harmonies between these paintings, even though the compositions and how the palette strikes you when you first take a look at them are vastly different.
Right.
In fact, I even commented on that with Andrew to curate it in this space. Wasn't easy.
Yeah.
Because there's some internal natural harmonies that do relate between these paintings, like this whole wall right here.
Right.
And it's because they all have this pop of green in them and that orange. And so, and also that sort of, well, other than this one doesn't have that lavender color in it.
Right.
But, so that's why, I sort of end up having to do that. And then that interplay with the octopus and those ones that have that lavender color and orange oddly work because those also have grays in them.
Right.
They all have a lot of gray and not so much white. Whereas the two on this wall with the Euclidean Razzle Dazzle and the Descending Datura are the ones that have that much dominant white and distinctly different palettes. The one being more lavender based and this one being more blue based. And that's why I thought, well, those two read together because they're at least based on blue.
Right.
So that's how I tried to break them up, and then they go well with the purple and the octopus, and that's sort of how it wraps around, and ending up now with the two most distinctly different paintings opposite each other.
Right.
But yet, what holds them together peculiarly is this orange.
Right.
So, but there are these internal harmonies where they really do. It seems like there's discord, but there's not.
Right.
You know, but also now after talking to you, the other themes that emerge out of this is camouflage.
Right.
So you're really playing off of camouflage a lot, and a lot of different things in nature, on top of the ocean, under the ocean, on a leaf, you know, and you know, on a flower. And so what's interesting is you know, how this dialogue exists between this whole show on a lot of different levels, the musical notes, the palettes, the titles, you know, how they're basically constructed, this sort of asymmetry, symmetry. So there's a lot happening in the show beyond just the things we started with, which is the fact that, you know, they're diptychs.
Right.
You know, you've moved away from the pure overlapping lattices to these more pure tessellations, and the narrative titles and things. So there's, you know, it's an interesting show, and you really made a lot of big steps away from that work and that show was what, 3 years ago, 2017?
Yeah.
So, but what was interesting, you've done a few things in museums, and you started moving this way.
Yeah.
That trio of paintings that were was that in the Denver Museum, the modern?
Or the one in Colorado Springs?
Oh, maybe that was Colorado Springs.
Yeah.
Yeah, one was a traditional
for the
grid,
arts, yeah.
And that's when you started dealing with some of this asymmetry, which I wasn't sure I understood at first, but now after talking to you, I see kind of where you were going. So in a couple of these museum presentations that you've done, you've been introducing this new work, and this is sort of the first formalization of it as a body of work.
For sure.
And what's nice about it, when you do a project as an exhibition, you thoughtfully tie it all together. It's not just you're doing 6 random or 7 random paintings.
No, yeah.
And that's what I think is really fun about your work and about working with you is that you really like to put a show together as a statement, and it makes a statement on a lot of levels about you personally, about you know, formally. It's a bold statement, and it's all interrelated.
Right.
This one also punctuates something very personal to you.
Right.
Your dog who had cancer, and unfortunately
passed away.
This show was completed and shipped off, and she passed away.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of touching and sort of sweet and poetic at the same time. And that, you know, and you mentioned about the springs. You said you started taking her with you to the springs as sort of to help as therapy.
Yeah, for her too. Yeah.
You know, and which I'm not sure she was particularly happy with you at first when you put her in cold water.
No, but I
can just imagine my dogs in her reaction.
But I figured, you know, it was better than, you know, you know, there's worse things.
Yeah.
You know, it did like put a little pep in her step.
But but that's very sweet, and so we're sorry to hear that. But it kind of makes this a more meaningful show to you.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Because you guys really
spent a lot of time.
Yeah, spent a lot of time together.
We were good buddies, so
yeah.
We still are, but just different now.
So
still have memories. So
yeah. Oh yeah. So. Lots of videos and lots of
videos. Yeah, that's for sure.
Just look at your Instagram feed.
Yeah.
And anyway, so this has been great. I appreciate you taking the time to help explain a lot. It's a very powerful and dynamic show. They're beautiful paintings, but I think this narrative is really great. It's given me a lot more context now for some more writing, and which I enjoy writing about your work. And anyway, so I hope everybody goes online. There's a 360 view of this. There's a ton of installation images. And there are a lot of images of each of the paintings. So if you can't come in because of the pandemic, or you're just living out of state, you can enjoy a lot of aspects of this. And we hope you enjoyed this video and meeting Andrew.
Thanks. Thank you, guys.